Thanks, Churchill, for putting this together and for your kind of broad take. I think we all recognize that this crisis comes at a time when the media are dealing with a longer term crisis of revenue and profitability. If you look at the newspaper market, it peaked around the turn of the millennium, and print circulation has been falling since then. Advertising revenue across all media platforms peaked around the time of the financial crisis, so around 2008, and has actually been dropping since then. So it's the perfect storm at a time when media houses across the world have been trying to reinvent themselves. Then comes something that basically decimates print circulation in markets that rely on people picking up newspapers from vendors rather than home deliveries. But even in markets that require home deliveries because of the fear of infection and basically the lockdowns, that those have been affected. The advertising revenue as well has disappeared in most markets and formats because of the slowdown in business activity and the fear. One of the first things that people do cut when there is a crisis is advertising and marketing spend. How has this manifested itself? We have seen closures of newspapers and some outfits. In Uganda, for instance, the Observer newspaper stopped printing its weekly edition. We snowballed our own sports weekly newspaper. And if you look across the continent, there's been the smaller newspapers in particular are struggling to just stay alive. There have been layoffs of journalists and other people who work in media houses as a result of the slowdown in the business. And we're seeing reductions in salaries for journalists. Traditionally not the best paid profession anyway, but we're having to take pay cuts in several markets, Tanzania, in Kenya, in Uganda, and so on and so forth. So there's long-term pain for the industry, and now we have come into an existential crisis. My sense is that there are two ways to look at the current problem. The first is that it's probably going to accelerate the death of many smaller media houses. So the smaller newspapers, the media houses that do not have diversified sources of revenue. So if you just a print media house without, for instance, radio, without television, I think those are going to suffer a lot. If you look at the circulation figures from the Audit Bureau of Circulations in South Africa, the trend from around 2015 is downwards, year on year, quarter on quarter, in newspapers, dailies, in weekend newspapers, in weekly newspapers, in magazines. So print on the ropes, and very few will survive for a long term after this crisis. But it also presents an acceleration for those that have been working on kind of digital strategies. This then creates a push, it pushes the boat out faster into the sea, and those that I think are better prepared will survive. Others will flounder and probably end up underwater. So the way I see it, there is a test now of the underlying business model of especially mainstream media, because this crisis has exposed our reliance on old models, for instance, selling newspapers on the streets, but also our very high reliance on advertisers. So I think you're going to have to see a business model that that depends more on getting money from our customers and by selling them our product in digital formats. I think the other thing is that we're going to see probably a test of whether we can renew our social contract with our audiences in terms of whether people trust us after this crisis, whether they still see the need for viable independent media houses. I think Churchill said something about journalism is not just for journalists. I think the conversation on how to fund public interest journalism needs to happen, because what we have is private interests paying for a public good. And it is very clear now that that social contract and that business model is under threat. So in summary, we've had a long-term problem of trying to stay in business, since the turn of the millennium as the digital disruption happened. I think now we have a dual problem: one, to stay in business, and how to stay in journalism itself. Thank you. First, to clarify, my comment on the sports journalists covering other bits wasn't a recommendation. It was explaining what many are doing. My own sense is that actually, I agree with Marsh that this is the time for enterprise and for people to find more innovative story angles and ways of telling stories. I would in fact expand that beyond sports, because many of the other traditional bits aren't happening. So the courts aren't sitting or are sitting remotely. Many parliaments are closed. There are no workshops. No press conferences. I think generally journalists have to become more enterprising, and that speaks to there's an earlier comment about kind of the threat of social media. I think there is a danger, and we're all guilty of it, of taking our analog content to a digital landscape. So if all we are doing is to take electronic versions of our newspapers as e-papers and put that online and expect people to pay for that as a mainstay, I don't think we're going to succeed. But anyway, my own sense is that it's a very useful conversation that we've had, but that this conversation needs to, it can't just be something that happens once a year on May 3rd. I think one gets the sense need for more regular and more forward-looking conversations. I think Tamrat makes a very important observation that we shouldn't try to reinvent a future that just replicates the past. In other words, if we're going out there to try and claw back print circulation or appointment viewing ratings for television or radio, I think we would have missed the boat. I think the post-COVID reality is a completely different landscape and a different ecosystem for us as journalists and media practitioners. So I think there is a call for closer cross-border collaboration. We have seen it on investigative journalism projects like the Panama Papers. Many of these are coordinated remotely by the likes of International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. I think we need to have a lot more homegrown collaborations that report on stories across borders. And we need to obviously have an ongoing conversation about sustainability and funding models, because there might be things that people are doing in different countries that appear to be working, and we can then pilot those across the region. So very specifically, in closing, some of the things that we think need to happen to take this conversation forward. The first is that there is, and Churchill mentioned this in the beginning, that we're thinking about a special issue of the East African Journalism Review, which will focus on the journalism in our region, so the emerging trends, journalism safety, financing models, viability, and so on and so forth. And some of you will be asked to contribute to either expand your presentations today, or just to write on kind of specific areas, so that we curate these conversations in one place that is accessible. There are also conversations that are going on to revive the East African Editors Forum, and this conversation is part of those activities. And there is an ad hoc steering committee which over the next 3 months is going to work to put flesh on the idea, so that there's structures and there's an infrastructure that allows us to have these conversations more regularly and with very specific outcomes. And then finally, we were also going to have over the coming weeks other webinars on safety themes to help journalists against threats, whether it's threats from governments, whether it's just how to cover the pandemic, so that there is a lot more information gathering and sharing amongst editors across the region. My final comment is that what these conversations reveal to us is that trust has become a premium currency for media houses. That whether it's engaging with governments and having them recognize us as essential, whether it is engaging with audiences and having them come to us as trusted sources of information, and increasingly as people that they're willing to give money to in a world where they can find free information on social media, I think has become extremely important. So putting trust back into the newsrooms, into our journalism, I think is quite an important thing. Thank you.